Back in December 2021, I uploaded the final episode of my The Truth About COVID-19 from a Stranded Australian trilogy. I'm very proud of this series. I studied relentlessly for over 2 weeks and gathered over 150 sources to build my position. But the part I'm especially proud of is the reference system I used. Any evidence shown would accompany a number on the top right corner that would correlate with the number and source in the description, allowing the viewer to have access to my sources and research their own conclusions. I'll be using this same system in this video. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because in episode 2 I gave a rule of thumb for how to navigate the government's handling of COVID-19 and all other subsequent doomsday scenarios. If the media and politicians claim the worst is about to begin, throw those fear-mongering thoughts of theirs in the bin. Quite catchy that, but does it hold up with the new crisis, the UK heatwave? All over the media they're claiming that this new heatwave brings a serious threat to life, that we're in a climate emergency and surface temperatures are breaking records as the highest temperatures ever seen in Britain, with serious threats to human life. Looks like the media and politicians are claiming the worst is about to begin. But does my rule of thumb still apply? Before we investigate to find out, let me take you down memory lane and give you just 3 examples from my COVID trilogy exploring how the government and their political stranglehold on mainstream science inspired this rule of thumb in the first place, before I attempt to apply it to the UK heatwave. Using fear to manipulate the population. Starting out strong, the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behaviour, or SPIB for short, were the advisory group to the government and had the task of laying out the blueprints for how the pandemic should be managed with the public. Their immediate advice was to weaponize behavioural psychology and amplify the perceived personal threat of the public to terrify them into compliance. SPIB warned in March last year that ministers needed to increase the perceived level of personal threat from COVID-19 because a substantial number of people still did not feel sufficiently personally threatened. Gavin Morgan, a psychologist on the team, said, "Clearly using fear as a means of control is not ethical. Using fear smacks of totalitarianism. It's not an ethical stance for any modern government." Laura Holdsworth's book, A State of Fear, How the UK Government Weaponized Fear During the COVID-19 Pandemic, showcases how these advisors later expressed deep regret when they saw the policies and guidelines they championed created a society of paranoid hypochondriacs with chronic COVID-avoiding behaviours that are still going strong.
According to the National Library of Medicine, in a journal article titled Propaganda, it states that members of the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behavior, SPIB, expressed regret about the tactics, about the role of psychology in the government's COVID-19 response.
Bruh.
One SPIB scientist told Ms. Dodsworth, "In March 2020, the government was very worried about compliance and they thought people wouldn't want to be locked down. There were discussions about fear being needed to encourage compliance, and decisions were being made about how to ramp up the fear. The way we have used fear is dystopian. The use of fear has definitely been ethically questionable. It's been like a weird experiment, ultimately backfired because people became too scared. The most significant factor is that ministers have faced repeated accusations that they have ramped up the threat from the pandemic to justify lockdowns and coerce the public into abiding by them. Essentially, politicians had an outcome they wanted in advance: lockdowns. So use the SPIB as one of the subcommittees that advises the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, or SAGE, to establish a campaign of fear, not science, to encourage compliance. And now, as the SPIB look at your OCD COVID-safe mindset that they paved the way for, they lament to themselves and distress at the abomination they've created. But there's your first example. The government will amplify the perceived risk, not the actual risk, to engineer a state of perpetual fear so you will comply with policies you would otherwise never accept. You can see more about the blueprints of the COVID pandemic in episode 1 of my COVID series. Booster shots and Omicron. When the booster shots were made available in the UK, virtually everyone with links to the NHS got bombarded with text messages and emails from the government telling them that we strongly advise you to have the COVID-19 booster vaccine, as evidence shows that 2 vaccine doses alone are not enough to effectively protect you against the Omicron variant that is now in circulation. You need a booster to gain maximum possible protection. Seems pretty harmless. Just the NHS telling me what the evidence shows, right? That to achieve maximum possible protection, I need the booster shot, because 2 shots of vaccine alone are not enough. Surely they just care about my health and safety. This is the NHS after all. I'm sure the evidence is absolutely reflected in this science-led policy to promote the booster shot. They wouldn't lie to us, would they? Well, let's find out. On the 21st of December 2021, 2 days before I received my first NHS booster email, the UK Office of National Statistics released a report that, in Tab 1B, showed the modelled likelihood of testing positive with an Omicron probable result in people who tested positive for COVID-19 by Screen Demographic Characteristics UK. Basically, the report shows how likely you are to get Omicron based on a few demographic characteristics. The most significant of these characteristics is vaccination status. They compared unvaccinated, double vaccinated, and triple vaccinated, or boosted, to determine the likelihood of getting the new Omicron variant. With the unvaccinated as the reference, 1, we can see that the actual evidence gathered by the UK's Office of National Statistics shows that you are literally 445% more likely to get Omicron if you get boosted than if you're unvaccinated. You are 226% more likely to get Omicron if you're double vaccinated than if you're unvaccinated. And you're 157% more likely to get Omicron if you're once vaccinated than unvaccinated. Literally the opposite is true. The evidence shows you are far more vulnerable to Omicron if you follow the NHS's advice. Evidence shows that for genuine maximum possible protection from the Omicron, you should follow the opposite to the NHS's advice.
It's definitely a no for me, dog.
Now I need a moment to highlight the irony here. Omicron is spreading. The government promotes a booster program to combat it. The NHS starts spreading propaganda contrary to actual statistical evidence. The media terrifies the public with nightmare scenarios of what an unboosted Britain would look like, resulting in major pockets of the population taking the booster shot and becoming 445% more likely to catch and spread Omicron. Omicron cases spike dramatically, so what happens next? The now super vulnerable triple vax demographic dogmatically share the sentiment of,
"Those stupid unvaccinated, boosted inferior swine. They refuse to get boosted because they're anti-science conspiracy theorists. They've caused an Omicron spike due to their selfishness and ignorance. Anyone who spews anti-booster shot misinformation should be silenced. Unlike me, I followed the science and got my booster shot pronto."
Absolutely ironic. You can find out much more about the NHS and media reporting on COVID in episode 2 of my COVID series. But there's your second example. The experts will reference the science and evidence till the cows come home, from a position of authority, like the NHS, then just spout whatever political agenda they want anyway. Policies to save or destroy. Finally, during the coronavirus pandemic, the government claimed that their policies were designed to save lives. How'd they do? According to a 2020 article published by the Centre for Economic Policy Research, titled "The Long-Term Impacts of the COVID-19 Unemployment Shock on Life Expectancy and Mortality Rates," they discovered that when trying to assess the long-run effects of the COVID-19 economic recession on mortality and life expectancy, COVID-19 related unemployment resulted in a 3% increase in mortality rate and a 0.5% drop in life expectancy over the next 15 years for the overall American population. We also predict that the shock will disproportionately affect African Americans and women over a short horizon, while white men might suffer large consequences over longer horizons. These figures translate in a staggering 0.89 million additional deaths over the next 15 years. That's this many people. This is because unemployment and poverty kills, and limiting people's access to work and participate in society is more harmful than the risk posed by COVID, which is why, in South Africa, actuaries using the same pandemic models as the UK found that lockdown restrictions will lead to 29 times more lives lost than the harm it seeks to prevent from COVID-19 in South Africa. Hardly policies to save lives, though it gets worse when you look at the impact of COVID restrictions on other serious illnesses. This is because early detection is a crucial key to successful recovery from an illness. But with COVID taking the limelight and forcing treatments for all other illnesses to the sidelines, there has been a monumental increase in the HIV, malaria, tuberculosis, and cancer deaths as a direct result. Germany's Minister of Economic Cooperation and Development, Gerd Müller, has warned that lockdown measures throughout the globe will end up killing more people than the coronavirus itself. A leaked study from inside the German Ministry of the Interior revealed that the impact of the country's lockdown could end up killing more people than the coronavirus due to victims of other serious illnesses not receiving treatment. The findings dovetail with other research that's concluded that lockdowns will conservatively destroy at least 7 times more years of human life than they save. Professor Richard Sullivan also warned that there will be more excess cancer deaths in the UK than total coronavirus deaths due to people's access to screenings and treatments being restricted as a result of the lockdown. His comments were echoed by Peter Nielsen, a Swedish professor of internal medicine and epidemiology at Lund University, who said, "It's so important to understand that the deaths of COVID-19 will be far less than the deaths caused by societal lockdown when the economy is ruined." In addition, a study published by The Lancet that notes physical distancing, school closures, trade restrictions and country lockdowns are worsening global child malnutrition. Literally, the deadliest part of the coronavirus pandemic are the restrictions, the lockdowns and the mandates designed to combat it. These policies will end up destroying more lives than the coronavirus ever could. Ironically, you'll hear more politicians utter, "if it saves just one life," as a justification for these disastrous and lethal policies more than any other crisis in recent memory.
Once again, the opposite is true. Even to the point that a Stanford medical professor stated that lockdowns are the worst public health mistake in the last 100 years.
For a lot more on the consequences of COVID policy on society, from the rise in mental health deterioration, the rise of substance dependency in the elderly, teen suicide attempts, and much more, see episode 2 of my COVID series. And that concludes the third example. The government, the media, politicians, and experts will identify a problem, then offer a solution several times more hazardous and dangerous than the initial problem, and then celebrate it as a resounding success with zero consideration for the collateral damage they've enabled. Hopefully these 3 points give you a small glimpse into what inspired my rule of thumb. If the media and politicians claim the worst is about to begin, throw those fear-mongering thoughts of theirs in the bin. In virtually all cases, the mainstream narrative on COVID was either a straight-out lie, or the opposite was true. The UK has a heatwave. Essentially, anytime the government handles something, they do a terrible job. They lie through their teeth and end up promoting policy that does so much more harm than good. Unfortunately, when it comes to the UK heatwave, this pattern continues. Reports are flooding in saying that the 2022 UK heatwave is the hottest on record, that it's a national emergency, the UK's first red extreme heat warning.
The hot weather has now been deemed as dangerous as this. A red weather warning last brought on by Storm Eunice. Now for the first time, a heat wave is just as extreme. The UK's Health Security Agency says this is a national emergency.
To be fair, it's true. Charlwood provisionally breaks UK temperature records with readings of 39.1 degrees Celsius. Charlwood in Surrey has provisionally recorded a temperature of 39.1 degrees this morning, which if confirmed, will be the hottest temperature ever recorded in the UK. Now yes, it is hot, but bear in mind it is hot for the British and their aircon-free homes designed to retain warmth. For perspective, in the United Arab Emirates at 6:30 in the evening with the sun setting and clouds in the sky, which is very rare, the surface temperature is also 39.1 degrees Celsius.
I only realized in editing that it's 39.7 not 39.1, over half a degree hotter than the UK's record.
Regardless, yes, Charlwood in Surrey did break the hottest temperature ever recorded in the United Kingdom on the 19th of July 2022. But the devil is in the details, so remember Charlwood, because there's a very important secret about Charlwood that we'll explore very soon. Addiction to hysteria. Earlier I mentioned the scientific pandemic influenza group on behaviour expressing regret at manipulating and terrifying the public into compliance.
Behavioural psychology is now very deeply embedded in government. It's how the government does things. It's how they get us to change our ways, to become model citizens and to follow rules. And one of the big learnings for me in this book is not just how they've used fear supposedly in our best interests to make us follow lockdown rules, it's how much behavioural psychology is part of how the government relates to us. There was a really extraordinary document that was released last year, dated March 22nd, where the behavioural scientists who report into SAGE and the government said that some people were too complacent because they understood that the risk of death was low for their age. And so what they recommended doing was raising the sense of threat for everybody to encourage us to follow the rules. That's an open admission.
This was members of the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behaviour, SPI-B, is that how we pronounce that? They were
well done for spelling out.
This kind of conditioning can also be called addiction to hysteria, because the heatwave you've just heard be described as a national emergency has a name. It's summer. It's called summer. This recent COVID-established conditioning to be addicted to hysteria and the latest end of all human life emergency is highlighted by comparing how the notoriously grey and cloudy UK reported heatwaves in the past versus now.
Britain's been basking in the heatwave again. In many parts of the country it's been hotter than Hong Kong or Honolulu. At Liphook in Hampshire it was 92 degrees, the highest recorded temperature of the year so far. At Southampton and Cardiff it was just 1 degree lower. The best place for a cool down was the Shetlands, which had today's lowest temperature, 52 degrees.
The sun beat down on the first royal garden party of the year at Buckingham Palace. The Queen, the Duke of Edinburgh and the Prince and Princess of Wales circulated among the guests, who traditionally wear formal dress. Some must have felt distinctly overdressed for temperatures in the upper 80s. A dozen collapsed and had to be revived in the St John ambulance tent with ice and fans. A lot less was being worn in the Welsh capital, Cardiff, hottest city in Britain today, with an official maximum recorded at 91 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperatures in direct sun reached 110 at Welshpool. If the bathers felt sticky, the chocolate biscuits in this Cwmbran factory felt downright mutinous, refusing to set and making a sticky mess out of an ordered production line. Inside this Hampshire foundry, the heatwave has become a distinctly bad joke. The furnace runs at 1,000 degrees centigrade. Some of the men say they've lost half a stone in weight since the heatwave began, and they're keeping their fingers crossed there won't be a water shortage. No shortage of ice for this chap, Andy the polar bear cub at Atlanta Zoo. He plans to keep his head down and hibernate through the summer.
Oh! Oh no! Oh no! They're coming in through the back door! Oh no! Oh no! Grab the children! Save the children!
This hysteria can also perfectly be seen when comparing the graphics used by the BBC to report the summer of 2012 heatwave versus the summer of 2022 heatwave. One clearly looks hotter, because it's literally depicted as if the whole nation is on fire. They use the same colour palette as Doom, for God's sake. But once you look past the obvious colour-based suggestion and focus on the more important numbers, you can make a line graph showing the temperature differences between the two. Given the absolute hype and hysteria over the national emergency, you'd be forgiven for thinking the blue line is 2022, since it's recording more hotter temperatures. But that's the 2012 line. This is the 2022 line. This isn't a reaction to a heatwave, it's an overreaction to summer. I mean, Oil Change International even referred to it as the heat apocalypse, for crying out loud. Before being addicted to heroin, after being addicted to heroin. Before being addicted to hysteria, after being addicted to hysteria. There's something about Charlwood. Now, remember Charlwood? Again, it's not a lie. The UK did record its hottest ever temperature, and it was in Charlwood, Surrey. So there must be truth to the panic, right? At least a little bit. How could these figures be manipulated? How can temperature readings be political propaganda? It's not like they're taking these temperature readings next to airport runways with heat-absorbing tarmacs and countless giant heat-pumping hot jet engines, right? In fact, if we see where Charlwood, Surrey is, you'll notice that, oh, it's right by Gatwick Airport. It basically is Gatwick Airport. But that's just a coincidence. In fact, the 39.1 degrees Celsius record in Charlwood was recently broken, and it wasn't even near Gatwick.
Well, good afternoon. We start with a new UK record temperature that has been set this afternoon at Heathrow Airport. 40.2 degrees was recorded, and temperatures could still climb further later this afternoon.
So let me see if I understand this. The former hottest ever recorded temperature in 2022 was Gatwick Airport, and the new hottest ever recorded temperature in 2022 was Heathrow Airport. I wonder if there's a connection there. What does 50% of all weather stations have in common? According to Professor Ross McKittrick in his 2010 report titled A Critical Review of Global Surface Temperature Data Products, he goes into a great deal of detail regarding the use of Global Historical Climatology Network, or GHCN, which is an integrated database of daily climate summaries from land surface stations across the globe. GHCN is made up of daily climate records from numerous sources that have been integrated and subjected to a common suite of quality assurance reviews. GHCN Daily contains records from more than 100,000 stations in 180 countries and territories. Essentially, when it comes to surface temperatures, the GHCN is Google. It's your Bible. That's where the temperature readings come from. Here's where it gets interesting. Professor McKittrick states that the number of weather stations providing data to GHCN plunged in 1990 and again in 2005. The sample size has fallen by over 75% from its peak in the early 1970s and is now smaller than at any time since 1919. The collapse in sample size has not been spatially uniform. It has increased the relative fraction of data coming from airports to about 50%, up from about 30% in the 1970s. On page 12, figure 1.6 shows the percentage of GHCN recordings that come from airports. This is global, this is the Northern Hemisphere, this is the Southern Hemisphere. As of 2009, 49% of all global surface temperature readings come from airports. In the Northern Hemisphere, 46% of all temperature readings come from airports. And in the Southern Hemisphere, 59% of all temperature readings come from airports. So the weather stations providing temperature records dropped dramatically by 75%, to the point where about half of all surface temperature readings come from airports. If you think about how many airports a country has, then consider that half the readings are originating from those airports. It drastically emphasizes just how overrepresented temperatures from airports are. And this is significant because airports are often in urban or suburban locations that have been built up in the past few decades. And the increase in global air traffic has led to increased traffic, pavement, buildings, and waste heat, all of which are difficult to remove from the temperature record. At this point, hopefully you're starting to realise the politics behind the reporting of the UK heatwave. But not only are half of all surface temperature readings originating from boiling airports, they're also coming from progressively lower altitude, which are of course warmer than areas of higher altitude. Professor McKittrick comments that GHCN sites reduce the average latitude of source data and remove relatively more high altitude monitoring sites. This had the effect of drastically altering the trends in global temperature, as these have tended to increase the warming trend over the 20th century. It is thus not surprising that Professor McKittrick's research casts further serious doubt on the validity of three major global temperature datasets, including the one compiled by the Met Office, which continues to show higher global temperatures compared with other reliable measurements made by satellites and meteorological balloons. So you have a large landscape with varying altitudes, land use, and of course, one airport. You could systematically sample the large and varied landscape to record accurate temperature readings of the region that are representative of the region, but that would be honest and fair, and you may risk not having peer-reviewed evidence-based data supporting your political agenda. So instead, you remove weather stations from colder high-altitude sites, leaving hotter low-altitude sites. You then progressively remove weather stations across suburbs, villages, and towns, to the point where half of all your readings are coming from the one or two airports with their hot jet engines and heat-absorbing tarmacs. And then, you publish your findings as representative of the entire nation. This act of gathering all your input from a single source to justify your position reminds me of an old Egyptian saying. Translated, don't put your nose in a monkey's butt, have a sniff, then say the world stinks. Likewise, don't gather 50% of all your surface temperature readings from just 0.1993% of the land, and then use those figures to fling fear-mongering alarmist propaganda onto the public like this.
By early next week, you can scrap 20 degrees, it could well be 40 degrees. I think there will be hundreds, if not thousands, of excess deaths early next week.
Then the gullible public mock the presenter as daft when they respond appropriately.
I want us to be happy about the weather and everything. I don't know whether something's happened to meteorologists to make you all a little bit fatalistic and harbingers of doom.
Oh boy.
The fact that satellites and meteorological balloons are recording highly reliable global temperatures that seem for some reason to be far lower than those provided by the GHCN, including the Met Office, should blatantly show the flaw in recording over half of your surface temperatures next to airport runways with hot jet engines and black heat-absorbing tarmacs while avoiding high-altitude locations. Therefore, is it not fair to conclude that the temperature readings fueling this new hysteria are fraudulent? Alfred Kinsey's research. Take Alfred Kinsey for example. an American biologist, professor of entomology and zoology and sexology who, in 1947, founded the Institute for Sex Research at Indiana University, now known as the Kinsey Institute for Research in Sex, Gender and Reproduction. He is best known for writing Sexual Behavior in the Human Male and Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, also known as the Kinsey Reports, as well as the Kinsey Scale. Kinsey's research on human sexuality, foundational to the field of sexology, provoked controversy in the 1940s and the 1950s. His work has influenced social and cultural values in the United States as well as internationally. His books were very influential in arguing that humans are more sexually deviant, promiscuous and, for lack of a better word, kinky than was previously believed. His research championed sexual experimentation and discovery as a path to true happiness, a finding that has since been adopted and celebrated by academia and culture. They've made movies about him with A-listers like Liam Neeson starring as Kinsey.
Hello, I'm Dr. Alfred Kinsey from Indiana University, and I'm making a study of sex behavior.
And the Kinsey scale has become just another accepted tool to measure a slice of the human condition. An example of Kinsey's work being immersed in the culture can be seen in episode 107 of the TV show Revenge.
Ambiguous sexual identity. I get it. I'm about 3 on the Kinsey scale myself.
But today, we recognize Kinsey as a fraud. Though Kinsey wanted to document and expose what society was doing sexually, he only concentrated on one section of society, the deviant. A great number of the 5,300 male interviewees were sex offenders, pedophiles, exhibitionists, while about 25% of them were prison inmates. Many of those who volunteered were also biased in favor of the sexually unconventional. Thus, because Kinsey wanted to research and document the human condition in terms of sexual behavior, with a hidden pre-established agenda to prove that humans were more sexually deviant than previously thought, he conducted valid scientific research, but on a fraudulent and deceptively selected sample in order to artificially force his conclusion. Of course, his findings would reflect that society was more sexually deviant and unconventional. What other conclusion could you reach if you're only surveying sex offenders, pedophiles, exhibitionists, prisoners, and other sexual deviants? Some snapshot of American society. Now, my point is that if it's fair to call Alfred Kinsey and his research fraudulent because it's based on data from sources that doesn't accurately or fairly represent the target demographic, being the typical American, is it not also fair to call the GHCN temperature readings fraudulent because they don't accurately or fairly represent the target regions, being places other than low altitude airports? I mean, would you go to an airport, look at hundreds of these giant machines with giant scorching jet engines, resting on fields of black heat-absorbing tarmacs, surrounded by miles and miles of parking lots, and think,
this would be the perfect spot to set up weather stations to accurately and fairly record and then represent the temperature of the UK?
I absolutely agree. Let's hope anti-science conspiracy theorist climate change deniers don't spread misinformation against us.
Absolutely ridiculous. That's like recording house temperatures by attaching a thermostat to a clean, well-exposed wall in the kitchen, above the oven, by the kettle, by the toaster, by the microwave, and without an exhaust fan. Same problem, only unlike airports, the kitchen doesn't take up a minuscule 0.1993% of the house. To put these numbers into perspective, imagine if these 1,000 dots represented the entirety of the United Kingdom's land use. That's everything. Every town, school, shop, road, airport, everything. From these 1,000 dots, all airports in the UK would be represented by just these 2 dots. Crazy coincidence, but these 2 dots also represent the industry with the hottest surface temperatures. And, double coincidence, this is also where 50% of all surface temperature readings come from. And these temperature readings are used to reflect temperature trends here. Does that sound fair to you?
Or are you one of those anti-science conspiracy theorist climate change deniers? Stop spreading misinformation.
Is not artificially forcing results by primarily surveying people who will very likely fall in line with your pre-established world narrative the exact same hoax as artificially forcing results by primarily recording temperatures at locations that will very likely fall in line with your pre-established world narrative? Why is this fraud and this unquestionable settled science? Both results are fraudulent. In fact, I'm going to go one step further. Right now, I am going to prove to you that not only are the current temperature readings fraudulent, but future temperature readings provided to us today through computer simulations are also fraudulent. Brace yourself. Future climate projections. In episode 2 of my climate series, I talked about Professor Neil Ferguson of Imperial College London, who was instrumental in the decision to put England, France, the US, Canada, and many other countries into lockdown. Back in March 2020, J-Idea's Neil Ferguson tells MPs lockdown could help NHS manage coronavirus. So Professor Neil Ferguson of Imperial College London is a very influential man, with a very important role. Ferguson is a mathematician and epidemiologist whose work on the spread of COVID-19 is informing policy in not only the UK, but also France, the US, and other countries as well. The centre he founded with colleagues at Imperial College, the MRC Centre for Global Infectious Disease Analysis, collaborates with the World Health Organization. Fergus runs the group of scientists at Imperial College London whose projections help persuade ministers of the need to impose stringent physical distancing rules or risk the NHS being overwhelmed. Now, why am I telling you all this? In the simplest terms, it's because Professor Neil Ferguson of Imperial College London has the worst professional track record I have ever seen. The man has basically never even been close to accurately predicting a pandemic, or any other fallout for that matter. According to an article titled The Flawed COVID-19 Model That Locked Down Canada by the Montreal Economic Institute, or MEI, you get a glimpse into the accuracy of Imperial College London's computer complex models. Imperial College London's complex computer models predicted mad cow disease could result in the loss of over 150,000 deaths. The actual number was 2,704, wrong by 5,447.3%. Imperial College London's complex computer models predicted swine flu could result in the loss of over 65,000 deaths in the UK alone. The actual number was 457, wrong by 14,123.1%. Imperial College London's complex computer models predicted bird flu would result in the loss of over 200 million deaths. The actual number was 455, wrong by 43,955,943.9%. When it comes to COVID, Imperial College London's complex computer models predicted unmitigated COVID deaths for countries like Canada, the US, the UK, Sweden, South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. For Canada, Imperial College London's complex computer models were wrong by 6,206.83%. For the US, Imperial College London's complex computer models were wrong by 3,070.17%. For the UK, Imperial College London's complex computer models are wrong by 1,735.31%. For Sweden, Imperial College London's complex computer models are wrong by 2,465.65%. For South Korea, Imperial College London's complex computer models are wrong by 147,574.42%. For Japan, Imperial College London's complex computer models are wrong by 212,989.80%. And for Taiwan, Imperial College London's complex computer models are wrong by 3,028,471.43%. That's an average error rate of 486,073.37%. Which means Imperial College London's complex computer models are, on average and based on their recent COVID-19 simulations, producing incorrect results 486,073.37% above the reality. That's like saying 3,889,389 people will vote for Joe Biden for re-election in 2024, when it's actually 800 people. That's what being wrong by an average of 486,073.37% looks like. Time for the big picture. J-Idea's Professor Neil Ferguson of Imperial College London and founder of the MRC Centre for Global Infectious Disease Analysis produced computer models that predicted, on average, 486,073.37% more deaths than actually happened. And in some cases, as with Taiwan, predicted 3,028,471.43% more deaths than actually happened. Accuracy aside, Professor Neil Ferguson's exaggerated complex computer models were used by many government ministers around the world to justify and force millions into lockdown, causing millions of excess deaths from poverty, suicide, cancer, HIV, tuberculosis, malnutrition, and more. But don't worry, an article by Imperial College London states that lockdown and school closures in Europe may have prevented 3.1 million deaths. This is the conclusion of a modelling study from Imperial College London scientists published online in Nature Today, which suggests lockdown measures have been sufficient to control the growth of the epidemic. The team from the MRC Centre for Global Infectious Disease Analysis, Jameel Institute or J-Idea, and Imperial Department of Mathematics estimated reductions in transmissions based on combined data from 11 European countries up to early May 2020.
Professor Neil Ferguson. People don't agree with lockdown and try to undermine the scientists. After a year when his advice helped to drive pandemic politics and his personal life was news, Professor Neil Ferguson says he was mostly right.
All restrictions going tomorrow, where are we heading?
It's very difficult to say for certain, but I think 100,000 cases a day is almost inevitable.
Just 20 days later.
Bum, bum, bum.
Professor Neil Ferguson says he was mostly right.
Now, why am I telling you all this? Well,
scientists say that the record temperatures in Europe over the last few weeks would not have been possible without man-made climate change. A global team that included experts from Imperial College London and the Met Office have been running complex weather models since then to establish the extent to which greenhouse gas emissions made the heatwave worse.
just trust the science, bro. They're experts. For a lot more detail on the use of the computer models during the coronavirus pandemic, including a neat case study on the foot and mouth disease, as well as a scandal that got Professor Neil Ferguson in hot water, please watch episode 2 of my COVID series. Fear 2.0. Thus, I feel very confident in saying that, as with COVID, the government, mainstream media, politicians and mainstream science will lie, manipulate and weaponize everything from the air you breathe to the weather outside your window, all in an attempt to keep you in a perpetual state of fear until you buckle and accept their political propaganda as an absolute reality.
Cari fratelli, buongiorno.
What is the endgame? Now comes the question of why. The temperature readings reported on the news are all fraudulent. Half come from airports with hot jet engines, black heat-absorbing tarmacs, miles and miles of parking lots, concrete, and from areas of low, warmer altitude. Or they come from computer simulation models that are, based on averages from recent COVID-19 predictions, exaggerated by 486,073.37%, and consistently wrong 100% of the time. And all this to meet a pre-established political agenda. They just need you to be scared enough to quietly and obediently allow what they plan on doing to you. But hold on a second. Why would so much faulty, fraudulent, exaggerated data be force-fed to the public? What's the endgame? Well, in the UK, the surface data sets are used to weaponize the weather in the political interest of net zero. A few days of hot weather would in the past have attracted "Phew, what a scorcher" headlines, but now these are written along the lines, "Life-threatening heatbox in Tinderbox Britain." The Met Office regularly proclaims the temperatures at Heathrow, seemingly desperate to promote the highest measurement it can find.
We would not have had last week's temperatures without climate change, that's for sure. If we want to keep a heatwave like this a rare event, we really have to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions very soon.
Now, what is net zero? According to the United Nations, for a livable climate, net zero commitments must be backed by credible action. What is net zero? Put simply, net zero means cutting greenhouse gas emissions to close to zero as possible, with any remaining emissions reabsorbed from the atmosphere by oceans and forests, for instance. How can net zero be achieved? Transitioning to a net zero world is one of the greatest challenges humankind has faced. It calls for nothing less than a complete transformation of how we produce, consume, and move about. So, if the goal is to cut greenhouse gas emissions to close as zero as possible, the question now is, how can they police that? Don't they need to control what you can buy, sell, use, and in what quantities? They would need to re-engineer every aspect in your life, from your daily activities to the kind of foods you eat. For instance, would you be willing to eat bugs to slow global warming? Even if replacing animal-sourced foods with insects could limit the impacts of climate change by 80%, according to a new report? They're already socializing you into seeing bugs as a food in an attempt to normalize it.
What have you got for us here? Talk us through it. What have you got and what can we try?
I have an array of finger foods here. Let's start with these guys. These are grasshopper kebabs, teriyaki marinated, quite delicious. I heartily encourage that you try one.
Insects are becoming a trend. The Western diet has to kind of shift and change. And most importantly, it's natural, it's normal, and it's the way that we have to feed the future.
I'm Nicole Kidman, and I am going to eat a 4-course meal of bugs.
Stop it. Get some help.
Germany is even already selling insect burgers. Healthline released an evidence-based article on cockroach milk, a promising superfood or nothing but hype. Their conclusion, not influenced by political narrative of any kind, I'm sure, is cockroach milk is very high in nutrients and lactose-free, making it a theoretically suitable non-dairy milk alternative.
How about no?
But they know it's not enough to just market insects as yummy, progressive food of the sophisticated and righteous. So you will be manipulated until you are terrified out of your mind by relentless fear propaganda, until you believe that it's either eat bugs, reduce your use of electricity and fuel, or destroy the entire planet. If you won't eat bugs, would you allow yourself to be put under climate lockdowns to help reduce the temperature of the planet? What if experts from Imperial College London ran complex computer models based on GHC and temperature readings provided by the Met Office, which predicted that, without these climate lockdowns every 2 months, temperatures could reach up to 45 degrees Celsius by 2030, and hundreds of thousands will die due to the excess heatwave, with several ecosystems being destroyed and widespread animal extinction as a direct result of unmitigated greenhouse gas emissions. What choice are you going to make then? Are you going to risk being labelled an anti-science, climate change denying conspiracy theorist by accepting the truth? Or are you going to willingly accept the narrative built on fraudulent temperature readings, computer models inflated by 500,000%, from a community of political activists in lab coats, just to fit in and not be cancelled?
Computer modelling experts from Imperial College London paint startling picture of future UK summers. The findings come after complex computer models, using the latest surface temperature readings by the Met Office, warn of UK summers reaching 45 degrees Celsius by 2030 with hundreds of thousands of excess deaths, loss of ecosystems and widespread animal extinctions, unless radical COVID-style lockdowns for the climate are imposed bi-monthly. Neil Ferguson stated last Friday, climate lockdowns may be the only way to save the planet from the disastrous consequences of unmitigated greenhouse gas emissions.
Tough one, that. Regrettably, what is an inconvenience for some is death for others. This can be seen clearly in the Netherlands.
So what are the Dutch protesting about? Well, in the name of fighting climate change, the government plans to cut nitrogen emissions by 50 to 95% by 2030. Problem being, that's going to mean the end of at least a third of Dutch farms, with a 30% reduction in livestock putting many of them out of business. And as a further slap in the face, the same restrictions destroying farmers' livelihoods won't be applied to the airline industry. And suffice to say, the farmers aren't too happy about it. They're pouring shit on the homes of the ministers involved and government officers, while others are showing up with cows outside the Dutch parliament threatening to cull them on the streets. They also blocked the border between Holland and Germany. The government basically told them to go whistle, declaring, quote, "The honest message is that not all farmers can continue their business." This is basically the Netherlands version of the yellow vests. They're furious at being blamed for climate change when they're just trying to feed the nation.
These Dutch farmers are heroes, revolting against draconian measures that even see police shooting at 16-year-old farmers fleeing in their tractors.
Hey, wallah, rij weg, jongen, rij weg! Wapens is daar! Is dit een film? Ja! Is dit een film?
Farmers are the backbone of any society. For many farmers, it's the end of their business, and they will fight until the last. Sometimes these farmers go back generations. They were built by hand, and people feel farmers' heart and soul. This is all being taken away. All this for the end goal of net zero by 2030. The UK heatwave, or summer as your grandparents remember it, will be weaponized every single year until you're just as terrified of the weather as you were of the air during the COVID-19 pandemic. And if you don't fall for it and even police others to comply, you'll be labeled a climate change denier, planet burner, anti-science conspiracy theorist that's spouting misinformation. Which is ironic because it's even reaching a point where lessons I teach my Year 7 geography students about the difference between weather and climate would utterly destroy the mainstream political narrative of this heatwave. I made a video on this difference a year ago where I defined weather as short-term conditions that can change drastically many times within a single week, and climate as the average of weather over a long period of time, typically 30 years, in a specific area. This means that the one thing you can't use to reflect climate is weather, unless it serves to scare the public and you're an expert, that is.
It's summer, it gets hot, we should be prepared.
Well, that's the classic mistake to make. This is not normal temperatures for a summer in our city and our country. Records are going to be broken this year. 40 degrees is not normal. It's one of the consequences, by the way, of climate change.
It's false. No way. Not this time.
Now, Year 7s, remember, weather does not reflect climate. Climate is based on averages, and one very hot day or one very cold day cannot be used to measure or generalize trends in climate. Unless the experts say it, then you just got to accept it without question, or you're an anti-science climate change denier. What am I trying to prove? So let's review. We've learned from the government handling of COVID that they're not above using psychological warfare, using the trusted platform of medical organizations like the NHS to spew a political narrative in spite of the evidence, promote policies that harm more people than it seeks to save, and allow themselves to be guided by monstrously inaccurate computer models. What I submit to you, my valued viewer, is that the government's handling of the UK heatwave is not above using psychological warfare, or we use a trusted platform of scientific organizations like the Met Office to spew a political narrative in spite of the evidence, promote policies that harm more people than it seeks to save, and allow themselves to be guided by monstrously inaccurate computer models.
Pow!
And there you have it. My rule of thumb for navigating the latest crisis can be successfully applied to the heatwave too. The government, mainstream media, politicians, and especially the politically motivated experts are all at their usual terrify, influence, control game. And all they need is your blind trust and fear. Don't give it to them.
CNN's technical director, Charlie Chester, said the media company's next focus will, quote, that they will beat to death like they did with the pandemic. Will be climate change. Let's take a look.
We're going to start focusing mainly on climate, climate like global warming, and like that's going to be our next I don't know, what's the word I'm looking for? It's going to be our focus. Our focus was to get Trump out of office, right? Without saying it, that's what it was, right? So our next thing is going to be for climate change awareness.
So that's like the next
pandemic story that will beat to death. But that one's got longevity. You know what I mean? It's not like there's a definitive ending to the pandemic, or it'll taper off to a point that it's not a problem anymore. I think it's going to take years, so they'll probably be able to milk that for quite a bit.
Piers Morgan Uncensored. Recently, Piers Morgan interviewed the two climate activists who blocked the motorway, causing thousands of cars to be idle and pumping tons of carbon monoxide into the atmosphere for hours more than they otherwise would have, all in a bid to protest too much fossil fuels and carbon emissions. Yes, that happened. Needless to say, these two are absolute idiots. They basically single-handedly quadrupled the carbon emissions for each commuter during their anti-emission stunt, and added a few £1 million more money in the pocket of fossil fuel companies while doing so. Because, in what should be obvious to anyone that isn't a pretentious motorway-blocking climate activist, a car driving on the motorway will emit carbon monoxide into the atmosphere for as long as the car is being used. If two morons create traffic, that car is in use for much longer, so it will produce more carbon monoxide into the atmosphere, which is presumably the opposite of the two activists' goal. But the important point is that if the carbon monoxide a vehicle would produce in a 30-minute journey suddenly takes 4 hours because of climate activists, your journey is taking 4 times longer. That means you're using fuel 4 times faster, which means you'll need to buy fuel 4 times as often, and so on. But here's the thing, you now need to take this cause and effect scenario that's quadrupled the carbon emissions and apply it to literally every car on the M25. So these two literally became some of the top polluters in the Northern Hemisphere. Now, I'm not going to hide my feelings towards these stupid, sanctimonious, self-righteous, virtue-signalling bedwetters, especially since you now know their actions are reactionary to fraudulent data designed to artificially force a desired result. But what I would encourage you to do is to watch the interview after having watched this video, and just see how brainwashed these two are.
Oh, great heavens!
Trust me, it's an eye-opener. Final thoughts. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, my rule of thumb. If the media and politicians claim the worst is about to begin, throw those fear-mongering thoughts of theirs in the bin.
We're like, the world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change. And your biggest issue is, your biggest issue is, how are we going to pay for it? And like, this is the war, this is our World War II.
Thank you for watching. I got LASIK surgery over a week ago, so making this video, researching it, writing the script took much longer than it normally would have. But I just knew I had to make it. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section and what you think the next fear campaign will be. That'll be an interesting one. If you like this sort of video, you will love the COVID-19 series I made. Show it some love, link in the description. Honestly, you won't believe how wrong they got COVID. Also, please support my channel by clicking subscribe, leaving a like, commenting on the video, and hitting the bell. Cheers.